Badass of the Week is produced by High Five Content. September 15th, 1940. The skies above London grow dark as the droning hum of hundreds of attack aircraft slowly approach. Seemingly endless waves of Henkels, Junkers, and Dorniers draw closer to the British capital, their bomb doors loaded with thousands of pounds of high-yield explosives, primed and ready to detonate among the civilian population of England's largest city. Only one thing stands between them and their target. Rising quickly to meet this looming juggernaut is a squadron of heroic pilots, their throttles open, their noses pointed at a wave of oncoming foes. Outnumbered and outgunned, these brave flyers have put their faith entirely in their own aircraft, a state-of-the-art fighter plane, sleek and streamlined, heavily armed, more maneuverable than anything the world has ever seen. The German bomber formation scatters as a dozen Spitfires dive into their midst, banking and turning, each machine barking fire from 8 .303 caliber machine guns. Several of the enemy begin to smoke as bullets rip through their fuselage. The Spitfires bank into a turn, then break off into combat formations as the German fighter's scream descends upon them. The dogfight is on. Hello, and welcome back to Badass of the Week. My name is Ben Thompson, and this is the show where we tell the badass history of badasses. I am joined today by a very special guest. He is an award-winning film editor and director. He's been in the industry for 27 years. He's worked on dozens of documentaries, and he is here today to tell us about not necessarily a badass person from history, but a badass vehicle from history. David Fairhead is with us today. David, thank you so much for being on the show. It's great to have you here.
That's my great pleasure. I'm going to pick you up on one tiny bit of detail. There's actually, and sad to say, I've been in the industry for 40 years. That's an old CV.
40 years. Oh my gosh, it's a CV from 13 years ago. Okay, so even more than that, 40 years. You've won awards for your work. You did Shadow of the Moon, which was incredible. You did a series called The Churchills that I really enjoyed. You did Last Man on the Moon. And much of your work has been focusing primarily on space program and World War II aircraft, which is what we're here to talk about today. What kind of drew you to those two topics?
I've had a lifetime's interest in aviation, picked up from my father, who was in the RAF for a little while, but he was very keen on aviation in the 1930s and 40s as he was growing up, so I just inherited it. And I remember vividly still when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, because we were living in Hong Kong at the time, and I got to watch it on a colour television in the hotel we were staying in, even though the footage on the moon was black and white, but there you go. It was it was really sheer good fortune that led me to working on films about the space program, starting off with a BBC series called The Planets in 1998. And that kind of rekindled a kind of long lost childhood interest, if you like, since Armstrong walked on the moon. And then it seemed unstoppable. Nearly every job I got offered was about space.
You got typecast as a space film editor.
I certainly did, but there's worse things to be typecast as. Like, it could have been.
That's true.
And then that just kept going, and I made the transition from working on TV documentaries to cinema documentaries, feature documentaries. So hence Shadow of the Moon was the first feature doc that I cut. And that continued until about 2014, when a great friend of mine, Ant Palmer, we met up for a pint at the pub not far from where I'm sitting right now. And he said to me, do you think there'd be any interest in a feature documentary about the Spitfire? And I had the idea some years ago, but never got any traction with it. And I said, yes, absolutely, I think they would. And so we decided there and then that we would embark on this, making this film. And the first thing we had to do was go and interview veterans, because at the age that they were in about age 93, 94, the surviving Battle of Britain pilots. And we thought, well, we better make a start on this. So we just did, we didn't have a budget or anything, but we could just, we recruited a few other people to come and help us, and we started filming interviews with these old pilots and women as well, who'd been in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. So that was really the start of it then, and we didn't finish the film till 2018. But.
That was a good time for that, though. I think like Band of Brothers had just come out and they were doing interviews for that, and it's what you said, you were running out of time to get these stories on tape. And the documentary you worked on is called Spitfire. It came out in 2018, but you have some really incredible people, really incredible Spitfire pilots, like you said, men and women, who were able to come on and talk to you guys about their experiences flying the aircraft. But before we get too far, we need to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll continue talking to David Fairhead about the men and women behind the Spitfire. Welcome back. David, as I said before the break, lots of men and women from all over were happy to come and talk to you and your crew about flying the Spitfire.
That's right. Yes. I mean, I don't know quite how famous they are across the pond, but certainly here, for me, they were almost legendary in their status. So people like Geoffrey Wellham, who had been, if there's such a thing, a bog standard Battle of Britain Spitfire pilot, who had really gone under the radar for decades and decades. And then in the 90s, he published a book called First Light, and it catapulted him into like the A-list of Second World War veterans. And he appeared in dozens of documentaries over here. But I felt that we were very, very lucky to get him because, in fact, especially lucky because we turned up to interview him in Cornwall in the far southwest of England. And I think he'd forgotten we were coming.
Oh, no.
Yeah, he hadn't shaved, and his shirt was a bit sort of unironed. And because normally he set it up so he'd do the interview in the local hotel where it was all sort of, they were all ready and set up for him, but instead we did it in his house, and it gave us a much more kind of intimate interview with him. And although he tended to say, like a lot of people who have to repeat their stories, the astronauts were exactly the same, would tend to repeat these stories, and they probably get a bit better every time they told them. I think he gave us a very honest interview, and so that felt like a real privilege to get him. Another chap was Tom Neal, who flew Hurricanes in the Battle of Britain, actually, not Spitfires, but his first squadron had been equipped with Spitfires. So he had the tantalizing prospect of getting to fly in these things, and then they were whisked away from this squadron and replaced with Hurricanes. And so he flew Hurricanes during the Battle of Britain and in Malta as well. So they were two very significant people we interviewed, and you were
also coming at them having no big studio behind you or anything. You were just a couple of guys, it sounds like, just kind of emailing people saying, hey, can we talk to you, can we record you? And then to be able to get these people who were big names, right? These are big time war heroes, and to have them agree to sit down with you and to get that footage, I think it must have felt pretty good.
It was, yeah. I mean, we had to negotiate. There were a few hoops we had to jump through. As they do get approached by, or they were getting approached by people every week. Could we interview you for this TV show? Could we interview you for that TV show? So in a way, we had to prove our pedigree, and so our progress to each of them was kind of monitored by. There's an organisation called the Battle of Britain Fighter Association, and they were the gatekeepers. And so if one interview went well, then they pass us on to the next one, and that's how it seemed to work. And then the other thing that we really wanted to get was the female contribution to the Spitfire story. And this varied. There was the RAF, or the Royal Air Force, had this part of its organisation was called the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and these were women who worked in the plotters. You've all seen the movies with them, like using the croupier sticks of moving little tokens around on the map. No computers in those days, and
yes, it looks like the world's biggest like Warhammer game. There's
exactly,
all these little airplanes on the table, and they move them all around as they're getting, which is just amazing. I mean, those stories are so incredible because they get the radio coordinates, and then they have to move the pieces on the board, and that's what the commanders have to work with for organizing counterattacks and interceptors.
Yeah. But it gave them a great overview, and so we got one lady, Joan
Fanshawe. She was great. She's in the documentary, and she's awesome.
Yeah. But then also we got two female, what were called ferry pilots, and they worked for an organization called the Air Transport Auxiliary, which had male and female pilots. But uniquely for this time, they were paid the same as the men. So it was a very a groundbreaking organization in one respect, and their role.
The U.S. had something similar to that with the Wasps, where they would they were women who were not in a combat role, but they would fly the aircraft that were built in the U.S. They would fly it over to England, which was still dangerous because you're still flying an aircraft with, Allied markings on it, and therefore you are a legal target to attack if you come across any German patrols. But there were many women in the U.S. Army Air Force who performed a similar type of job, and so it was really interesting to get that perspective on the documentary.
It was exactly the same role, and there was even a tie-up between the Air Transport Auxiliary and the Wasps. There was a very famous American aviatrix called Jacqueline Cochran, and she came over from the US to the UK and met her Air Transport Auxiliary counterparts at the time.
Yeah, and she was pretty senior in that organization. So I've written about Jackie Cochran on the website before, and I've actually written about, you've been doing yours for 40 years. I've been doing my job for 20, and I've written about many different pilots, including Jackie Cochran, including, I don't know, probably a dozen different Spitfire pilots, but I've never actually written about the machine itself, and it's a thing that I've written about various machines and vehicles throughout history. But for whatever reason, I get emails all the time for people saying, "Oh, I can't believe you haven't written about the Spitfire yet." And I kind of tend to agree with them. I have a model of a Spitfire on my shelf in my office, but for whatever reason, I hadn't written the story. But it is one thing that's very interesting about the Spitfire is that, when you think about vehicles from World War II, especially aircraft, the Spitfire seems to stand out as a place on its own, right? You'd mentioned the Hurricane, but I feel like anytime somebody who doesn't know too much about the Second World War sees an aircraft with British markings on it, they just assume it's a Spitfire. And, I think it's very interesting that this particular plane has had such like a lasting impression, has become such like a symbolic or an iconic vehicle amongst aircraft from the Second World War.
No, it really has. And that was one of the reasons why when Anne said to me, "Do you think there'd be any interest in making a film about it?" I said yes, because I once said to somebody, it's almost like it's in the British DNA now. But it has also spread across the world. And as you say, it's a recognizable aeroplane in the same way that very few aircraft are actually recognizable, but that aircraft is. And its beginning was almost romantic because it went back to the racing aircraft of the 1930s. There was a competition that had gone on since before the First World War called the Schneider Trophy for seaplane racers, and it was very fiercely contested. The US won it at one stage, the French won it, the Italians won it, and the rules were that the country that would win the outright the trophy had to win it 3 times in succession, and I think the Italians had won it twice in succession, and that's when R.J. Mitchell got involved to design a new aircraft that would be able to take the Italians on. And that aircraft was initially the S5, and then the S6 and the S6B, which won it. And it flew amazingly at 407 miles an hour. And this was in 1931.
Yes. And so that's such an interesting, like, what an amazing time for aviation. You were talking about your dad being into aviation in the 30s. And yeah, so they had this Schneider Trophy. It was a seaplane race, as you said. And like that said something like over 1 million people would come out to watch this thing. And one thing that you mentioned in the documentary as well is that when this competition began, the top speeds of these aircraft were like 45 miles an hour. And when the Supermarine S5 or S6 wins it in 1931, it's going over 400 miles an hour. And it's just so wild to think about. The Wright brothers flight was like 25 years before this, and now we've got aircraft. We've gone through all the wild design of their aircraft. Then you've got the biplanes and the triplanes, and now we're kind of getting into the Supermarine S6. Kind of looks like Spitfire, like with the floats on the bottom, and just to see how fast the technology develops so quickly, and to have it be kind of this Wild West situation where people don't really know what's going to be the best thing, so they're trying all kinds of crazy stuff. So you see all these wild designs for aircraft at this time.
That's right. I mean, and the other thing that really was literally propelling the aircraft was the engines, and again, funnily enough, the Americans had led the way in this in their seaplane races in the mid-20s, and Rolls-Royce looked at the design of the American engines to say, okay, we can do something with this, and they built a racing engine. It was a V12 called the Rolls-Royce R engine, and it produced a phenomenal amount of power. Now, the advantage, because people often say, why on earth did they put them in seaplanes? Well, the reason was because a seaplane could have a very long takeoff run. And for a racing engine,
interesting.
A racing engine only wanted to go fast. There was no requirement for it to go slow to allow you to land the thing on a even a mile long runway. So they could just produce phenomenal amounts of power. And
that's really interesting, because you were saying, and the things I've read about this were like, oh, these seaplanes were the fastest planes in the world, and that doesn't track right now because we have, I have seaplanes that land in the lake behind my house here, and they're not anywhere close to the jet fighters that fly over during air shows and things. But that makes a lot of sense because they had so much runway to take off and land. They could get up to these huge speeds, and as I think with all flight and space travel and everything, the hard part isn't necessarily getting the thing up in the air; it's landing it with everybody alive on board.
That's right. As pilots say, any landing you can walk away from is a good landing.
Yes. And so this Supermarine S6, it's being built and it wins, and so it's the fastest aircraft on Earth. And you mentioned R.J. Mitchell; he's kind of the lead designer for the Supermarine company who's developing this aircraft, and will go on to develop the Spitfire. And we've kind of talked about different countries being involved and trying different things. And as you mentioned in your film, around this time, there's a lot of interesting aircraft technology being developed in Germany, and Germany is also demonstrating, we know what's going to happen in the future, but by 1931, there is already some rumblings that there might be conflict in Europe soon, and having a high-tech, very advanced Germany with really weird and interesting aircraft is a little bit concerning to the British government.
Well, that's absolutely right. But the funny thing is, it was Churchill who was banging on. Everyone else was thinking about peace because, the First World War had only ended in 1918 and nobody wanted to think about rearming. And Churchill was the one person who was looking at what was going on in Germany, and he watched the rise to power of Hitler. And he was the one who was saying, we've got to do something about this. And the real symbol of the German rearmament campaign was the size of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. And we were, the UK, and in fact, most of the European air forces, and probably, in fact, even the US Army Air Corps at the time, was was flying biplanes. And the Messerschmitt 109, when that came in 1935, I think that was built. Again, a V12 engine, incredibly fast, really capable aircraft, and suddenly everyone else can see we've got a fight on our hands here, and in a few years' time, literally that would be the case.
So we don't have an answer for this. You can't send the Fokkers up after this thing. You can't send the Sopwith Camel out to fight this ME 109.
No. It was clear that, in particular in Britain, the RAF would require new aircraft, and the Air Ministry, which was the department of the government, always gets a bit of a bad rap for being navel gazing kind of organization that says no. But in fact, they recognized this as well. And there were people within the Air Ministry who were saying, well, not only do we need these new fast fighters, but they have to be heavily armed. And so a specification was issued by the Air Ministry to manufacturers, and it stressed that the aircraft has to be capable of carrying 8 machine guns, which at the time was an unheard of amount of firepower.
And so the biplanes in World War I, they were equipped with maybe 1 or 2 machine guns, which was plenty to get the job done because the aircraft in that war were made out of canvas and wood. But as we get into World War II, that's, 1 machine gun's not going to cut it against the Henkels and Jungers that are going to be flying over England during the Battle of Britain. So work has to be done here, and that is where R.J. Mitchell and Supermarine come into play.
That's right. I mean, Mitchell famously said because obviously one of the distinctive things about the Spitfire's design is its wing shape. And it's been a lot of talk about it over the years. But he famously said, I don't care what shape it is, I've just got to get the guns in. So he knew he knew very much what he was designing, which was a war plane. And it was designed very much as what's called an interceptor fighter, which was a short-range aircraft, but with very high performance. And the idea was, especially here in Britain, is that there's only 20 miles of sea separating us from the continent, and if France were to fall, which of course it did, the enemy aircraft would be able to get across really quickly, and they could build up height over the continent before coming over. And one of the key features of air combat, even in the First World War, was height. It was realized that if you wanted an advantage over your adversary, you had to get high. So that was why they were fitted with powerful engines, the Merlin engine, and as the case in the Spitfire and the Hurricane. And the idea was they had to get as high as they could, as fast as they could. But the expense of that meant that they couldn't carry very much fuel, which later on in the Spitfire's career would really come to hamper it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes. And so the engine is built. You mentioned the Rolls-Royce Merlin. That is designed. There's a lot of work that goes into this. You mentioned in the documentary the story of Beverly Shenstone, who was one of the designers at Supermarine. He was a Canadian guy. And you mentioned one thing that I hadn't heard before, which is that he at one point got a job working at Junkers to check out what the Germans were working on over there.
Well, that's right. Because he'd come over, he'd studied in Canada. He came over to Britain, couldn't get a job here, so hence why he went to Junkers. But it was very, 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 very useful in many respects, because he was able to see it firsthand what they were working on. And yes, there are rumours that he might have been a spy, but it hasn't been officially confirmed.
Can't be confirmed or denied. Wow. Okay. And so the new fighter, the Spitfire, is designed and built on March 5th, 1936. It has its first test flight. And you were able to find somebody who was there to watch it, which I thought was amazing.
Well, that was extraordinary because we'd been to... I live not that far from Southampton on the south coast. And that's where the Spitfire's first flight happened, because Supermarine were based in Southampton, because Southampton's by the sea and they'd be building seaplanes. And we went along for its, now what birthday celebration would that have been? Its 80th, I think. And we met a couple of people there, including a chap who had worked for Supermarine, but just after the war. But we got chatting to his wife, whilst everyone was taking photos of him, we got chatting to his wife, Judy. And I just happened to ask her, so do you have a connection with the Spitfire as well? She said, oh, yes, my dad helped build it. He helped design it. And I saw its first flight. And as a filmmaker, bing, your antennae goes up. And so we were talking to her what everyone else was talking to her husband. And yeah, she was there as a small child, but she remembered the first flight of the Spitfire. And that was quite incredible.
Wow. That was amazing to hear her describe it. And at the time, you know, as with many of these things, and you've probably encountered this with your interviews with the astronauts, we're just like, yeah, we just got up there, we did it, and it flew and it worked, and cool, everybody's happy. Her dad, who worked on it, was like, yeah, it looked good, everything flew, everything worked. Pilot got out at the end. Everybody's happy.
That's right. Apparently, the pilot got out and reportedly said, "Don't touch a thing." Now, whether that meant it's perfect, don't change it, or don't touch anything, I want to come back and check this, I don't know. But it's gone down in Spitfire legend that they got it right first time.
Maybe the first time in the history of engineering that's happened.
That's right.
So, you know, the development hits a little snag when R.J. Mitchell passes away in 1937 at the age of 47, which is just too young for that. Right. But the development continues. The Spitfire comes out in 38, and a year later, England finds itself at war with Germany. Germany invades, they march into the Rhineland 2 days after the prototype flight in 1936. A little more than a year after the Spitfire is accepted into service, Germany marches into Poland and England declares war. So now we have a situation where there's war between Germany and the United Kingdom. And as you said, the Bf-109, Germany's main fighter aircraft, has been in development since 1935, and they've been building lots of these, and they have a huge air force. And a lot of these guys that are piloting these aircraft are experienced veterans. They've been flying over the Rhineland, over Poland, over Spain during the Spanish Civil War. And suddenly the Royal Air Force needs to not only ramp up production of the Spitfire, which is something that they do especially by hiring women into the workforce to help build these engines that we were talking about. But they also need to find and recruit pilots and train them up on this relatively new aircraft and get them ready in a hurry so that they can fight the most powerful air force on Earth. It seems like it would be pretty daunting.
I think it was pretty daunting. I mean, I think at the whole time during the Battle of Britain, the biggest, funnily enough, the biggest issue was not the number of aircraft available, because the aircraft factories managed to ramp up production. As you say, they recruited a lot of people to do it. They just worked round the clock, churning these things out. And even when the factories were bombed, which they were, they managed to disperse production. So the production of aircraft, funnily enough, wasn't the problem. At all times, it was the pilots and training enough pilots and to give them enough experience to go up against, as you say, the experienced German pilots. And the RAF's tactics were really last war in some respects. So the Germans had developed a tactical system which became known as Finger 4. So it was two pairs of aircraft, which meant that you had a lead aircraft and a wingman. And the RAF flew in what were called VICs or Vs. So an aircraft at the front and two wingmen. But the problem with the Vic is that the formation was too tight. And so the two wingmen were keeping their eye on the lead pilot and not looking out for the enemy. And the RAF lost countless pilots and aircraft just because of that simple tactical error, if you like, until they realized what they were doing wrong. And then very quickly they dispersed to a much wider kind of formation, or even adopted the German tactics.
That's one thing that comes across a lot in war. They always say that, the generals lead the war, but they fight the war that they grew up fighting, which is usually last year's tactics. It's the old stuff. And that ends up being a problem for the Allies across the board in the early days of the Second World War, because Germany has new stuff. They have the Finger 4, they have the Blitzkrieg. They're fighting a different war on land and in the air, and the Allies aren't prepared for it. And pretty quickly, A lot of those new Spitfires are lost. France is lost. The Battle of Dunkirk is only survived by a very narrow margin. And before long, Europe is suddenly finding itself under control of Nazi Germany. And, like you said, the channel is only 20 miles across. And now there are German bases being built there in preparation to launch what would be almost certainly a naval, like an amphibious attack on England. And so this is where the Battle of Britain comes from, where Germany is planning on crossing the channel and attacking England. But before they can do that, they need to remove the British air cover, because the ships are going to be kind of sitting ducks for British aircraft. So the German Air Force needs to establish air superiority over England. And the way they're going to do that is by launching these bombing raids, just kind of overwhelming force, as many waves and waves and waves of bombers and aircraft to try to either bomb the UK into submission outright or weaken defenses so that they can launch an attack. And we find ourselves in that very, a number of famous Churchill speeches, but we find ourselves having to rely on a very small group of people to defend the island against what up to this point has been an invincible air force. And that's right. Where the Spitfire comes in.
Yeah, that's right. The few, as they're known, as Churchill named them, but of course he got that from Shakespeare. We happy few. The Royal Air Force was very fortunate in that not only did it have the Spitfire, it had the Hurricane. And yes, argument still rages today about which was the better aircraft.
The underappreciated little brother of the Spitfire.
That's right. I think the reality is that the Hurricane was the tail end of biplane development, which had gone on right through from the 20s to the 1930s, and eventually the Hurricane was, as some would say, a monoplane version of the Hawker Fury, whereas the Spitfire was a brand new concept in aircraft design, and that's why the Spitfire was that bit better. Sorry to say, everyone, than the Hurricane, but they both had a role to play, and The Hurricane was a very, very stable gun platform. It was easier to build and easier to maintain than the Spitfire. So often is the case, even today, sophisticated technological machines take a lot more upkeep than do sort of more bog standard things. And
like a Ferrari versus a Honda Civic.
Exactly. Yeah. The high tech.
Ferraris are fun to drive, but it's very expensive to maintain that.
Yeah, exactly. And you don't want to ding it.
Yes.
But the RAF worked out a way of using its resources really well. So Keith Park, who is the in charge of 11 Group, which was that part of the Royal Air Force that was looking after the sort of southeast corner of England, only had to engage certain enemy formations and not others, because the Luftwaffe would send over feint attacks using 109s to try and draw the fighters up and then destroy them, because they always had the advantage of height. And eventually they worked out a way of doing it so that generally, didn't always work out like this, but generally the Hurricanes would attack the bombers and the Spitfires would attack the 109s, which were top cover. So, up at sort of 25, 30,000 feet. And that's where a lot of the combat took place. And some of the iconic photographs you see of the Battle of Britain with vapor trails over St. Paul's Cathedral in London, those vapor trails are really high. But that shows just how widespread the combat was and how intense it was, that these aircraft were twisting and turning at that height. And there are sound recordings that the BBC made, which you can still hear. I don't know if they're available online, but I've certainly got recordings of them where that you could hear the gunfire and the twisting and turning of the aircraft from the ground. It's incredibly evocative.
I've seen pictures of, there's a very powerful picture of a group of school children and their teachers, and they're in like a bunker, but they're looking up at the sky. And it's like they're up there, they're watching the fight happen over their heads, which is just would be unbelievable. Like, it's unfathomable to think of now, of standing there and watching a dogfight over top of your hometown. That was how they were fighting them.
That's right. Well, I remember when we interviewed Tom Neal, and he talked about a combat he took part in over a town called Reigate, which is in Surrey, which is the county that I live in. And Reigate now, there's every time I drive on the motorway past that town, I think of that interview he gave us, where he talked about the twisting and turning and flying down, and his best friend was shot down there. And it is, as you say, it is hard to fathom that this took place in the skies above where we live, but it did. And when I was a kid, I had a metal detector, and I've still got it. But I used to walk along the hillside in Kent, where I grew up, and you could find shell cases from the Battle of Britain. Wow. Because they
would fall, I guess. That makes sense.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, sorry, David. We need to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll keep talking more about Spitfire pilots and their experiences. We're back. And just to add on to Tom Neal, who we were talking about before the break, he was talking about flying in the battle over Reigate and how he was so close to the enemy, he could see him. Like, he looked over and he could see the German pilot looking back at him through the cockpit. It's like, that's not how they fight air battles anymore.
It's not. He also talked about he was close up behind an enemy bomber, a Dornier, I think, and the crew bailed out. And as they bailed out, they were so close, their parachutes hadn't even started to develop, but they just whizzed past his aircraft. And again, I found that astonishing, that in this battle of machines, really, to see humans involved in it, 30,000 feet up, it's staggering.
Yeah, I did I took a driving class where you get to take your car out onto this airport runway, and you do autocross, just for fun, but like, you drive your car as hard as you can, and you learn how to do some driving techniques. And the guy in charge of it said something very interesting. He's like, the number one modification you can make to your car to make it faster is pilot training. Is improve the skill of the driver. And I feel like that's so important with this too. And like you said, the pilots here, there's not enough of them. And you get these situations where we have talked about the Women's Auxiliary Air Force running the radar stations and running the plotting boards. So these huge formations of German fighters and bombers would appear. They would come to command and Keith Park, and they would say, okay, well, we're going to send a counterattack. We're going to intercept this one here. So then the call goes down to the airfield. The guys, the pilots are sitting there in their uniforms. The alarm goes off. You see it in movies a lot. It's very evocative imagery of the pilots like, it's time to go. And they jump in. The Spitfire's already on, and guys are already putting ammo in it. They get in, they take off, they fight. But then they have to land, rearm, and in some cases they're doing this 2 or 3 times a day. They're fighting all day long, and then sometimes they're rearming while the Germans are attacking the airfield. And so, just the drain. There's not pilots. There's not a second like a second shift that can come in and take over. You're it, and you've got to. You're tired, but you've got to get up there and you've got to keep fighting. And it is this few number of guys. They're all somewhere and they're young. They're 18, 24, 25 years old. And they're from all around the world. As you said, there aren't enough pilots. You've got to take them from wherever you can get them. So you get pilots from, all across the UK, but also, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, South Africa. And then outside the Commonwealth, you have pilots from places like Poland and Czechoslovakia, which are, and France, which are under German occupation at the time. So kind of getting everybody together and whoever you can get and throw them at the enemy, behind this machine, and hope that they can get the job done.
Well, I think it was absolutely extraordinary that they were able to do this. I mean, as you say, back in the day, Australia, Canada, New Zealand were part of, what was then called the British Empire, but it became the Commonwealth. And there was a kind of loyalty to what they called the mother country. But for the other countries, like, as you say, Czechoslovakia, Poland, France, Norway, they had escaped from Nazi occupation. And then you had other countries as well, like the United States, where people who perhaps could already fly could see what was going on and wanted to be part of it. But for some, they wanted the adventure. For others, they could see what the Nazis were doing and they wanted to stop it. So they went across the border. In fact, there was even a sort of an undercover recruiting office for the RAF in New York. And people would go across the borders to Canada and sign up for the Royal Canadian Air Force. And they led to the formation of something called the Eagle Squadrons in the RAF, who were staffed completely by Americans. And they fought very well. And in fact, for Spitfire, I really wanted to try and tell this American part of the story, because a lot of people don't know about it. And so we got interviews lined up with two American pilots who had flown Spitfires during the war. One of them was a guy called Steve Pasanos, and the other was a guy called Bob Hoover, who became a very famous test pilot after the war. And we set the chutes up. And on both occasions, and this makes me sound quite a sinister person, they died literally the day before I got to interview them. But it was really sad, because they had been very well. But that's the problem with interviewing people in their 90s. They can go from being very well one day to not being very well the next. And so I never got to tell their stories, which was such a shame, because they had such amazing stories to tell. In particular, Steve Pasanos, whose book is called The Flying Greek. He was Greek. He was worked in the Greek sort of merchant navy, went to the US, set up a new life in the US, but really wanted to fly. So he's learned to fly, and then he joined he decided he wanted to go back and fight the Nazis. So that's why he joined the RAF. And he flew Spitfires for the RAF in the Eagle Squadron, and then they had to swap them out for P-47 Thunderbolts. And in the book, he writes very sadly about having to say goodbye to his Spitfires, because these enormous, great sort of barrels with wings took over from their sort of beautiful little Spitfires. But I think he got used to it.
Yeah. And that was it, because the United States was not at war with Germany early on in the Second World War. There was plenty of debate over whether or not we should be, but we weren't yet. And so you couldn't send U.S. soldiers there. So these guys would enlist in the RAF. They'd done something similar during the First World War. American pilots had flown for the Allies in the First World War before the U.S. entered the war. Just really an interesting component that people don't think about. And when the U.S. joins, they of course have to transition over to the U.S., or they of course do transition over to the U.S. Air Force. And I imagine it might have been a little sad to go from the Spitfire to the Thunderbolt. So how does at the Battle of Britain, how does the Spitfire compare to the Bf-109?
Again, there's always supporters on both sides. The Messerschmitt had one advantage over the Spitfire. They were very, very closely matched. Well, actually, two advantages. One, it had a fuel-injected engine, whereas the Merlin engine was fueled by a carburettor. The 109, the Daimler-Benz engine in the 109, had fuel injection, which meant that it could dive without centrifugal force forcing fuel into the fuel system, and that meant that it could always escape in a dive. Whereas this Spitfire and the Hurricane both suffer from this same fault, and the engine would falter as the carburettor either filled with fuel or was starved of it momentarily. Mm-hmm. And the other advantage that the 109 had was a heavier armament, because the 8 machine guns that we mentioned earlier were 303 machine guns, roughly .30. And in fact, they were American guns, Brownings. But by the difference between 1936 and 1940 was that those 303s were already almost obsolete, and because the 109 flew with cannons, with 20 millimeter cannon shells, which just packed a bigger punch. At a longer range, they were heavier. They were. This is a podcast, you can't see, but anyway, they were a much bigger shell, and they were an explosive shell as well. Mm-hmm. And that gave the 109 a big advantage in that respect. But the Spitfire could turn tighter. It was as fast. It was a very, very agile aircraft, and it was flying over its home territory. And as the Spitfire pilots would find out later in the war, the 109s flying over from France only had time for 5 minutes combat over London, for instance, before they had to go home. Yeah, and so they really had to look after their fuel, so they couldn't indulge in big dogfights, because otherwise they'd never make it home. And in fact, a lot of 109s sort of barely made it across the French coast before crashing. So,
wow,
that was really one of the advantages that both Spitfire and Hurricanes had. But as aircraft, they were very, very closely matched, and it really depended on the skills of the pilot as to who would win.
But that's an even better argument for getting that Spitfire out as early as they did, because it would have been really bad news if England hadn't began that process when they did. So it was good for Churchill and R.J. Mitchell to get the ball rolling on that early, so they weren't playing catch up. And then the Spitfire, so it's there at the beginning of the war. It's there over the first battles, the first air battles of the Second World War for the UK have Spitfires, and it continues to be in service throughout the entire war, although in different variations. We see a number of different marks of the Spitfire throughout the course of the war. That's right.
So the main, you have the Mark I and the Mark II. They were the two types that fought in the Battle of Britain. And then, as is always the case with things, it's never quite a logical development. So the next major mark was the Mark V, and this looked very similar to the Mark I or Mark II, but it had 20 millimeter cannon. They picked up from what the Germans were doing with the 109 and increased its armament. And then the Germans brought out the Focke-Wulf 190, which was a even more potent aircraft than the Messerschmitt 109, and so the Mark V was no longer able to counter the 190. So they produced the Mark IX by basically sticking a double supercharged Merlin engine on the front of a Mark V airframe, which suddenly could outclass the 190. So it is literally an arms race as for each side to produce better and better aircraft. And then the next big development for the Spitfire was a different engine called the Griffon engine. And the Griffon was actually a development of the Rolls-Royce R, which had been used in the Schneider Trophy aircraft, and produced nearly 2,000 horsepower, whereas the original Merlins, although they got sort of uprated, I think they got to about 1,800 horsepower, but the standard Griffon was 2,000 horsepower, which was a phenomenal engine, and only about, I think it was about 8 inches longer than a Merlin engine. So you can tell the later models of Spitfire just by the snout got longer and longer and longer. But,
you got to fit the engine in there.
That's right, yeah. But they were incredibly fast and incredibly powerful, and the average speed, I think, of the early Spitfires was about sort of 350 miles an hour. And by the time the Griffon engine Spitfires were out, it was almost 450. So it was, they were, quite extraordinary machines. But they ran into a problem, which goes back to the Spitfire's basic design, which we talked about earlier, of being an interceptor fighter, because they just couldn't carry enough fuel.
Yeah, because now they're going, as the war continues after the Normandy invasion, the Spitfire now finds itself on the attack. And now it's got the same problems that those Messerschmitt 109s had, that it's flying over enemy territory and it's got to carry enough fuel. And even if it's the superior aircraft, now the RAF pilots find themselves with 5 minutes of combat time before they have to turn around.
That's absolutely right. And in fact, even a little bit before that, it was found, because, the US had joined the war in 41, and the bombing, the bombing campaign really mounted by the RAF and the US Army Air Force really got underway in 43 when the round-the-clock bombing started. And for quite a long time, the US just did not have an effective escort fighter. Yes, you had Thunderbolts. Yes, you had P-38s, but they still didn't have the range to go all the way to Germany. And the Spitfire could certainly only go halfway across France, let alone that much further. But then this is where a story we couldn't tell in the film that I did want to tell. We just didn't have the time in which to tell it. It's about another great aircraft, the P-51 Mustang. And the P-51 Mustang came about because the Air Ministry, the much maligned Air Ministry, realized that even though we were building Spitfires and Hurricanes, we were going to run out of aircraft if the war kept going at that same intensity. And they sent a commission to the US to see if they could order more aircraft. And they approached North American and said, would you build P-40s for us? And North American said, no, we won't, but we'll build you a better aircraft. And the legend has it that it took something like 100 days to design from scratch what became the P-51. But when they built it and when they delivered it to the RAF, it had a big problem, and that's it had a V12 Allison engine, but it wasn't supercharged. And so, although it was very fast at low level, it just ran out of gas, of grunt, really, for about 10,000 feet onwards. And most air combat took place, as I said, at 30,000 feet. And somebody, no one has really worked out who it was, whether it was the Brits or the Americans, said, why don't we stick a Merlin engine in this thing? And they did, and the rest is history. And for me, what I love about the story of the Mustang's development is it's about the best of both the Allies working together. Brilliant engineering and the design of the airframe of the Mustang, which was much, much cleaner. Even though you look at a Spitfire and you think that's really such a clean, streamlined shape. Well, the P-51 was even cleaner. But by sticking the Merlin engine in it, it transformed it into this world-beating aircraft that had such long range. It could literally take the war all the way to Germany from England. And that's effectively what won the daylight bombing war was the P-51, because it allowed it to fly that much further. So that was, in a way, the evolution of the fighter aircraft from the biplanes to the monoplane era represented by the Spitfire and the Hurricane. And they handed over, in a way, to the P-51s, but still with the same engine. And that's what I love about that story.
I love that, the handing it off, right? So the Spitfire is still there. Spitfire stays in use for the entire war. It lasts in service until the 50s. But as you say, the Mustang kind of takes over because it can fly air cover over Berlin and keep the bombers, the Lancasters and the B-17s from being chewed up by the Focke-Wulfs, by the German interceptor aircraft. So, but for the Mustang to get out there and have such a successful combat record, it does have a little bit of the Spitfire in it, literally. And that's really pretty unbelievable. So the war continues. Spitfires, they end up being used in a role more to shoot down V1 and V2 rockets. So the Germans are not launching a bombing raids anymore, but they are firing guided missiles into England, and Spitfires are employed to intercept them and to shoot down rockets, which is a very interesting part of what they did.
Yeah, there's a distinction between the V1 and the V2. So the V2 was a ballistic missile that, in fact, although pilots reported seeing them being launched, there's no way they could catch those. But the V1 was, if you like, the first cruise missile. It was very, very crudely targeted just by the amount of fuel you put into it and the direction you pointed it in, and it went off. But it did have a jet engine. It's called a ramjet, and these things could fly at about 400 miles an hour. So although a Spitfire could could catch them, it couldn't catch it from a standing start. So they had to fly kind of air patrols, and then the way the defences were organised, they put a huge what they called the gun belt. Every anti-aircraft gun in the UK pretty much moved down to the south coast, and they fired at these things as they flew over. And then you had a narrow alley between the coast and London, which was defended by balloons, barrage balloons with cables on them. So the fighters had a very limited opportunity to get the V1s, but they did, and they shot down an astonishing number of them.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. I was hearing the stories of that in your movie, and I was very impressed by that, because it doesn't seem like, I mean, I guess we see some of that now with even in modern warfare, trying to shoot down drones and things, because the V1 was an unmanned, like you said, a cruise missile. But to be able to shoot that down from a propeller plane, it's not something you really think about very often when you think about air combat in World War II.
No, well, it was doubly dangerous because the thing had a 1-ton warhead, and you didn't want to be you didn't want to be too close to it when that went off. Yeah.
Wow. And so, so the for the rest of the war, obviously the war ends. Spitfires continue to be in service, though generally aerial reconnaissance and weather missions. And there are still a couple of Spitfires in RAF service that they use to do flyovers to commemorate Battle of Britain Day.
That's right. Yes, cool. There's an RAF. So for flight rather than a squadron, it's called the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, and they operate, I think on their books, they've got about 4 Spitfires, they've got 2 Hurricanes, they've got a Lancaster bomber, they've got a DC-3 Dakota, and yes, they use these for memorials, for air displays, and it's a really amazing thing that they keep these aircraft flying. Funny story: we were filming at RAF Coningsby, which is in Lincolnshire, on the east side of England, and whilst we were up there and we were filming the one of the Spitfires. In fact, it's the Spitfire that was last in service, and it was a weather aircraft, as he's described. So they took charge of that in sort of the late 50s, early 60s, I think. But whilst we were there, the Luftwaffe arrived because they were doing an exercise, because they fly Typhoons, the same jet fighters as the RAF fly these days. And a whole detachment of Luftwaffe ground personnel came. And then the first thing they did after they'd landed and secured their aircraft is they all wandered round to look at the Spitfires and the Lancaster in the hangar. They wanted to see this thing, even though it had flown against their forefathers. These aircraft really represent something, and it's just a very special thing when you see them flown by the RAF, because it means that they've never forgotten what it was that they achieved in those wartime years, and hopefully the people of not just this country but countries across the world will also always remember it, because it's such a great example of standing up to a bully, which is basically what Britain and Churchill did at the time. Yeah. And the RAF was the sword that was used to confront the bully.
Yeah, and so that was one thing I read, was that in the Second World War, anytime an American tank crew encountered a German tank, they called it a Tiger, and anytime the Luftwaffe encountered an Allied fighter, they called it a Spitfire, because that was the iconic thing that you were worried about encountering. And so I think, I guess my last question is, you've got footage in the film of Spitfires flying, and there is just something special about watching it, because the Spitfire does represent such an important piece of British history and world history and world military history, and to see it up there flying at the beginning, at the end of your film, it's just. And if you've seen Dunkirk, they got real aircraft to fly in the movie Dunkirk, and there's just something special about seeing that. I get patriotic for the United Kingdom, and I'm not a British citizen when I see that sort of thing.
Well, we're very pleased to have you on our side. It was extraordinary, actually, filming the air-to-air footage. So the aerial photographer is a chap called John Dibbs, who's a Brit, but he lives in Seattle.
Interesting. That's where I am.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, his career is very much US centric, but he spends a lot of time in the UK and in the summer air show period as well. But he brought so much to the project, and one of the things was this just fantastic eye that he has for airplanes, which I haven't encountered anywhere else, because he was a stills photographer but had done moving footage. But we worked with him to create these kind of narrative shots, and they were just amazing. And one of the things about the Spitfire was it is a truly beautiful aeroplane. You look at it. But there was one shot that we got where there were 3 aircraft coming up alongside the camera ship. And suddenly they didn't look like beautiful aeroplanes. They looked like sharks. And you suddenly realize this idea that no matter how beautiful it is still a warplane, and it's designed to shoot down other warplanes. So we could take the sort of, the rose-tinted glasses off in some respect and think, yeah, it is just a weapon of war, but it's a very beautiful weapon of war.
Yes, it's a bird of prey, right? It's a predator when you see it. It's got that beautiful wing shape, the elliptical wings that are so, easily recognizable, but it's a killer, and that's what it's designed to do, and that's what it did very effectively in that war. It did it for a good cause. It was defending its homeland from an attack, and from defending the people that lived there from enemy bombs, but that is what that thing was designed to do. It was designed to destroy aircraft, and it was very effective at it.
That's right.
So, yeah. So David, I want to say thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about the Spitfire. What is next for you? What are you working on?
Well, next for me, actually, there's another film in the middle here, which I should mention. So after Spitfire, we decided, especially having filmed at the Battle of Britain Memorial flight, we saw their extraordinary Lancaster bomber, which is a 4-engined bomber from the same era as the B-17. And we thought, we've got to make a film about that. So we did. So that film came out in 2022. And since then, I've been working on a film called Mosquito, and probably the least known of all these 3 aircraft.
For me as well, yes.
But it was a twin-engined multi-role aircraft, actually, powered again by 2 Merlin engines. And what was unique about the Mosquito is it was made almost entirely of wood. Plywood skin with a balsa wood filling. But it was incredibly strong. Today we'd call it a composite construction, and they'd make it out of carbon fiber today. But back then, it was formed over molds in 2 halves, glued together with, for the time, high-tech glue, and it was phenomenally fast. The first prototype, when it flew, was faster than the Spitfire. Wow. And it went on to be used as a fighter. It wasn't a dog fighter. It was like what was called a heavy fighter, or long range fighter. It was a fighter bomber. It was a bomber. It was a reconnaissance aircraft, a weather aircraft. It could do anything. It was a night fighter as well. And again, very, very sophisticated for its day, packed with radar and avionics. And they would go out and accompany the Lancasters on these long night raids. And so to this stage where the German night fighters, who were incredibly skilled and very brave, but they were terrified of the Mosquitoes because they never knew if there was one on their tail. So this is, as I said, the average age of the Spitfire interviewees was 93. When we did Lancaster, I think it was 97. Now I've done 14 interviews with Mosquito veterans, the youngest of whom was 99.
Wow.
So this is the
That's
tail
some longevity.
That's right. It's
pretty good longevity for a war hero, right?
Yeah, well, I know. They were lucky to make it to 21, let alone 99.
No kidding. Okay. Wow. So David Fairhead, film editor, director. Spitfire and Lancaster are both available for free to Amazon Prime subscribers. If you go on Prime Video, I highly recommend both of them. David, I'd love to have you back to talk about the Lancaster in the future. And when Mosquito comes out, I'd love to have you come talk about that as well, because I don't know anything about the Mosquito, and I'd like to learn.
Well, I'd love to come back and talk to you about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Is there, do you do social media? Is there any place people can look for you online other than to just watch the movies?
Well, I'm a very bad social media user. I did have a Twitter account. I don't use it at the moment, and I don't use Facebook either. So sorry. I do have a website, David Fairhead Film Editing, but it's much more about my. It's a website designed to get me work.
Yes.
Rather than anything else. But one day I'll sort it out.
Yeah, or you don't have to. My life is a lot better since I got rid of that stuff. So it makes my mental health is much improved since I've disconnected those things. Although it makes it hard for me to find on the internet.
That's not a bad thing either.
No, David, thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for listening to this episode. We really hope you enjoyed it, and we will be back next week with another badass. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stay badass.
Badass of the Week is produced by High Five Content. Executive producers are me, Ben Thompson, Dr. Patricia Larish, and Andrew Jacobs. Writing is by me and Pat. Story editing by Ian Jacobs. Mixing and music and sound design by Jude Brewer. Special thanks to Noel Brown at iHeartRadio. Badass of the Week is based on my website, badassoftheweek.com, where you can read all sorts of stories about other badasses. If you want to reach out with questions or ideas, you can email us at badasspodcast@badassoftheweek.com. If you like this podcast, please subscribe, follow, listen, and tell your friends and tell your enemies. And please leave us a rating. We'll be back next week with another one.